So I'm going to move us into question and answer mode now. Now, as you can imagine, this is going to be a challenge because there's 500 of you. There's 9 people here, all who are keen to answer your questions. So we'll have to see how it goes. But I'm delighted to invite one of our Drucker Challenge essay winners to have the opportunity to ask the first question. She is Robin Muzonza, and I think she's sitting somewhere in the audience over there, so if we can get a microphone to her. Robin is going to ask the first question to the panel. So thank you, Robin.
Okay, hello. My question is sort of, it mingles the different sessions together. With regards to globalization and growth, I wanted to ask, in developing nations, a lot of them face constraints such as economic sanctions, political instability, and they just don't have, they're not as technologically advanced as developed nations. So is significant growth then really possible if we don't have access to technology and that sort of thing? If we don't have access to trade with other countries, is it really possible for significant growth to happen in developing nations given the constraints that they face?
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. So can I ask our developing nations team at the end to start the answer to that? So given all the constraints, technology was one, is it possible? Is growth possible?
I think that the number one constraint and the number one priority for developing countries, including for Africa, is really building the infrastructure. And number one is building electricity, because electricity is the blood. 1/3 of Africa, hundreds of millions of Indians have no accessibility to reliable electricity. And if you do not have electricity, there's no manufacturing, there's no plants, and there's no hospitals to run, there's not even a charger for smartphones. And when it comes to electricity, I think that aside from domestic investment, attracting foreign investment, for example, Chinese capital in, coupled with Western technologies, could be a solution. Luckily, a lot of developing countries in the southern hemisphere has a lot of sun. And we're looking at solar power has already come down by 80%. And that solar power is already reaching a price level that is very competitive. So leveraging the cheap price of solar power and really get the electricity up, and that is the foundation, the number one condition for growth. And with that, I think it's totally possible. If not achieving 7-8% of growth, 4-5% of growth, that is the average of developing countries' GDP growth. Pretty good.
So that's quite a neat example of what we were hearing in the first plenary of both and thinking, which is we've got an issue where we've got a constraint with electricity, but looking for the solution in the growth as well, in terms of the green technologies as well. Okay, I'm gonna move along in this direction. So the group in the middle, you were talking about human prosperity. And in the context of the question that we heard Robin ask, when we're living in, and you spoke a bit to this, Neela, in extreme poverty or with a lot of constraints, how do we ensure that growth delivers the prosperity in those sorts of scenarios?
In those countries, there is a sort of frugal way of doing things, and people, when they don't have access to technologies or to things like that, they find other solutions to achieve their goals. And this is very interesting because they overcome the difficulties and they find solutions, and this is how we can really build sustainable solutions. But if I have to speak about my country, on the technological point of view, there is a good infrastructure, and Tunisia has invested a lot in technologies, in digital transformation, and also in educating people to technologies and preparing the new waves of people around being ready for the new jobs than around data, big data, and things like that.
And gentlemen, your perspective was growth is necessary, but we need to think about growth differently. So again, in response to Robin's question, what would your particular perspective be on developing and emerging countries? Anil, do you want to?
So, my perspective, and of course, Robin's question also talked about the, sanctions and, so therefore, how do developing countries, economies get access to technology? I'm a firm believer in the Bisa Moyo's, basic thesis is that the problem for emerging economies today doesn't lie in the developed economies. It doesn't even lie in connectedness. It lies domestically within the economies. Because if we look at the tech giants of the world, they're looking for the next billion, the next 2 billion customers. If you look at the world is awash with capital, that is looking for new homes, new destinations. And the problem, therefore, is not that the entities, organizations with technology or capital somehow are holding it back. The problem is that the emerging economies, either they haven't reduced the risks enough, or they have created their own barriers to access that technology and capital. So I think before, even if you look at China, which has been one of the most connected, globally connected countries, from 1980 to now, the about 10+% average growth rate of that, 8% was actually domestic. Yes, there was the impact of global connectedness, but that was at the margins, like say 2%. 8% was domestic, what China did.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open the floor now and see if we have any questions. We've got one here at the front and then a couple here. Can we have a microphone down here at the front first? If you could say who you are, where you're from in framing your question, please.
I'm Don Tapscott, and I'm from good preposition, Toronto. In the spirit of the quote about Einstein, spend 95% of the time figuring out the problem. Why do we have this problem of the bifurcation of wealth? This is the first time in modern history that we've had growing wealth and declining prosperity. The economy is growing, the middle class is shrinking. And Anil Gupta's shocking graph about the 5% capturing all the value in the economy. Why is that?
Okay.
We got bad people.
Well,
why is this occurring at this point in human history?
Different perspective from each panel. So let's ask that question. Should we start at this end in terms of?
Well, actually, not the first time. I think, Don, we've had this problem. So if we go back to the 19th century, marked by tremendous increases in domestic inequality in many Western economies, including the United States, and it required domestic political solutions in order to fix that, as in Teddy Roosevelt, et cetera. And it links back to the first question that we were asked by Robin. Governments still matter, and in some sense, the first question was, are there ways of saving people from domestic political arrangements that are unsatisfactory, at least given my own perception of globalization being a relatively feeble force? My answer to that would be, I wish it weren't negative, but that's the direction in which I would incline.
Okay. Nilofer?
I think it's an unfair premise to believe this is the first time it's happened. If you go back 250 years, can you hear it? Modern history. But if we actually think about how talent has been used over many years, it's usually been at the exploitation level. So when we were at agrarian stage, someone's ability to have human prosperity was relatively low when they were picking cotton and stuffing that cotton into a cotton gin. And so there was a very small group of people who actually had the ability to capture value, and it was that group who were landowners, who were white men. And so then we went to an industrial era, and I'm not sure if you remember that business actually argued against the change of child labor because they argued that they were actually feeding the children, so why would you want to eliminate child labor? There wasn't a framework at all that they could imagine that would be better than that. So I think each time we break where there is an opportunity to create more prosperity or more opportunity for human beings, it's because somebody changes the entire framework. of who is allowed to create value and who is allowed to capture it. I think the current model reinforces hierarchy and patriarchy. And so one of the reasons I'm arguing for distributed models, because I believe the power structure, if we leave it in place as it is, will perpetuate the 1% or the 5% in Anil's numbers, capturing the value. And so we actually need to shift over to a distributed model, which would let more people participate in the economy by being able to create value and then being able to capture it.
Thank you. And I know that distribution is not just a developed world thing, so I'm interested to hear what Joseph or Irene has got to say on this matter.
Hi. Particularly for the perspective of developing countries, I think a lot of what has stalled is our mental model of how this is supposed to work. You know, by and large, Western development theory basically has posited for the last 50 years that for places like Africa, it's an endowment view. Fix all of these things, and then, you know, governance, institutions, and then magically your economy will kickstart, right? Whereas in fact, actually, if you look at economies that have done well, it's quite the opposite. It's a bootstrapping view where you don't have everything fixed, but firms go in there anyway, and then firms create the pressure for government to fix some things, but it's partial. People are making it up as they go along, and then these governments are in turn creating slightly better conditions and more firms come in, right? It's this constant sort of partial innovation, right? And I think in developing countries, growth has stalled because we've felt like, okay, well, if we can just fix everything, and I'm simplifying, but if we can just fix everything, then we can leap straight into this magical world where we can leapfrog over this unpretty industrialization and we can go straight into services-oriented or tech-oriented economies. And that's not true. We've got to go through this nervous, unpretty, partial solution type of process of economic development.
Okay, thank you. Martin just wanted to make a comment.
So I think the temptation is to give a political explanation for the phenomenon. Obviously, there's a lot in, you know, trade policies and the role of government and so on. But I mean, you could also look at it as a simple dynamic explanation. I mean, on the pace of technology, the pace of change. I think Stuart Kauffman defines equilibrium as, you know, the stage when the fast stuff has happened and the slow stuff hasn't happened yet. And we're actually seeing inequality not just on the social dimensions we talked about, but even in the performance of companies right now. You've got this sort of legacy economy sprinting to so-called digital transformation to catch up digitally. So the people that are not benefiting from the leading edge of change in the economy are in a sort of a catch-up phase. I guess the good news is that we're already beginning to see sort of feedback loops kicking in and blowback phenomena. So it will equilibrate somehow. But the question is, you know, at what cost and with how much friction. So I look at it in a dynamic sense too.
Okay, I'm going to move on because we've got a couple more questions in the audience here, and gentleman at the front.
I'm from London, and also I'm a professor of management strategy. My question is, Peter Drucker believes, and his idea is creating customer. But if he would alive today, we strongly believe that he would not like the way our two emerging economy and one developed countries like US, India, China, creating human suffering and one sense killing the people by environmental pollution. I would like to ask a question the panelists.
No, could I keep, so what I don't want is from the audience that we have statements made, because obviously then we don't get a chance to hear from the panelists. So can you be clear on what the question is you'd like the panel to answer?
Now, how the panelists, and also there are 10 top management thinkers that can write a strategy to stop the air pollution in line with the business strategic development.
Okay. So the management contribution that so Richard had a perspective around the customer, and increasingly from your point of view, the management thinking that's contributing most to the way that the world is at the moment is what you're asking. So the latest thing. So Julia, shall we go to you first?
Well, I take inspiration from lots of different management thinkers. I mean, I'm particularly interested in Sandy Pentland of MIT's ideas on social physics and Herminia Ibarra's work on networks, in the sense that you were also talking about. I think collaboration and upending old models and reframing them is very necessary. I think that the corporate world is very wedded to a vertical model of operating. And the disruptors, like my poster man, Muhammad Yunus, know that that's not how you get change to happen. You have to upend the model. So the question for me is, how can the corporation, which, puts deep roots down, how can they have the same agility that tiny little entrepreneurs like me know, which is if you're failing, you just put a hard stop and do a U-turn. Lots of U-turns are going to be required to stop dysfunctional corporate activity. And the question is, do leaders have the bravery and the boldness and the gumption to do it?
Can I go to Joseph next? Because I'm curious from the story that you were telling in terms of how you disrupted, because power ain't giving up power. And yet, many of the examples that we've heard that has been possible. And I'm interested, Joseph, in what happened in your market to enable some of the shifts, and who did you take inspiration from?
Sorry, I couldn't see your face, so I was struggling to hear you as well. Yeah.
Who did you take inspiration from, and how did you disrupt the market?
Okay. So for us, I think the big disruptor was M-Pesa. M-Pesa definitely was a big disruptor for us. I can't really say that we picked that from a particular individual, but it was an innovation that came at the right time, that addressed a specific need of our people. And it just so happened that within our environment, that was the solution that was required. It has been tried elsewhere. But if you do a copy and paste, it's not going to work. You have to take into account the cultural context within which you're operating. You have to take into account the different socio-economics dynamics that are in that environment before you launch whatever innovation that it is. But for us, I think that was really, really important, that it addressed all those milieux. Yeah.
Thank you. Now I'm going to go to Slido, because we have a couple of questions which are very similar, which lots of you have voted on, which is around not just the measurement of growth, but even how we define growth. So our definition, and how do we reframe our ideas about it. You started to talk about it in the first panel. There are different elements of it. So I'm interested in your view on how do we reframe our view on what is growth and how we value it and how we measure it. Anil's poised, ready with the microphone.
I mean, I think I'd like to, go back to something I said in my in the panel brief overview, which is that I think economic growth, sheer just GDP growth is number one. I'm reminded of there was a joke I read in the Wall Street Journal a few years back, which I think is very telling. The dean of the business school was taking a stroll in the evening with his wife and saw this disabled, really terrible shaped person sitting begging, and the dean took pity, gave $20, and there was smoke and light, and suddenly actually it was God, and said, "You have been the only kind soul I have seen all day. Give you two choices. I make you the wisest person on earth or the richest person on earth." And the dean, of course, being a professor, said, "Make me the wisest person." Well, again, there was the...
you don't have to see if that's true.
The light and smoke, and the God vanished. And the dean sat down on the sidewalk and started sobbing. His wife said, "Did something go wrong?" He says, "No. Did you get your wish?" He said, "Yeah, so why are you sobbing? Now I know I should have asked for the money."
Okay, who's going to try and follow that one? Yeah.
Well, yes, GDP growth is most fundamental, but I was also kind of very impressed with what President Xi Jinping said at the latest 19th Congress. He said that, in the past, basically China has been trying to grow at all costs. Now he defines the goal as trying to pursue a balanced development that will satisfy better people's needs. So if you frame it from that perspective, then people's needs are much broader. Of course, you need to have the living standard, but then there is also the need for fairness. Then there is also the need for equality. There is the need for an ecologically more beautiful environment. I think that if you define growth as beyond just the material needs satisfaction, then it is really the means to satisfy a broader needs for a better life.
Okay, so you're starting to look at different definitions of growth and how do you balance and optimize those in that definition. Julia, you wanted to come in there.
Yes, I would echo that, being a little bit more elegant about how we define growth. A child, a baby, experiences what parents call a growth spurt, as in the child doesn't visibly grow in its development all the time. You have periods of plateau, you have periods of rest, you have periods of consolidation, you have periods of reflection before you grow again. The corporate model, market-led, GDP-led, is keep growing fast, make your quarterly results. Now that's one measurement of growth, but that's not a very sophisticated, diverse model. And I would echo the comment that has just been made, that we need to have a much greater variety in our garden of growth.
Nilofer wanted to come, then Martin.
I'm deeply inspired by Amartya Sen's definition of what we haven't measured well, because we can't measure it, it's immeasurable. He actually talked about the human capacity. And this word capacity is I think, the key. And I believe there is boundless capacity of people to add value in the world. I kind of think about it as the water table. It's there if only we could figure out a way to tap into it. And that becomes the objective then. If we think about it as capacity, then we kind of look at how people will solve the problem closest to them. So in emerging markets, it's the person looking at the problem that's in their face, and they will solve that problem. And right now, sometimes they can't because they can't get access to capital, or they're not enabled in other ways. But they want to solve that problem. That capacity to solve that problem is there, to figure out a solution that serves their local need and their local, how they can serve the world with their capacity. And so I think that's the piece that we might want to look at. And the problem is, right, we can't figure out a way to measure it. And most of us as leaders are asked, well, how would you know if you tapped capacity? And if we can't figure out how to answer that question, we're a little stuck.
Okay, all right, well, maybe we'll pick that up this afternoon. Martin, yours is the last word, because you're standing between these good people and lunch.
Well, I was maybe a bad way of ending the session, but I was going to sort of gently maybe disagree with Drucker's statement that what gets measured gets managed here, because it's often associated in practice with focusing on the things that we can easily measure. So we can easily measure the economic, the quantitative, and what has already happened. Whereas the interesting thing about growth is the opposite of those things. So an idea, a half-baked idea, before we have a fully baked lunch, is that maybe we can think about this as a cube with 3 dimensions. So one of them is growth now, growth later. So the sustainability axis. The vertical axis might be the inclusiveness axis, growth in aggregate, and then, the sum of the squares of the share of the growth, the broadness of the growth. And then maybe the z-axis would be something like the non-economic qualitative human aspects of growth, like education and happiness. So it's an idea I'm fiddling with. The volume of that cube, could we somehow represent that?
Well, it might seem difficult to imagine that we are only the first morning into this, and we still have an afternoon and a full day tomorrow. And already there's a richness of view and perspective which will hopefully see you well into lunch. We will be back here at 2 o'clock to start again. Lunch is back where you had coffee this morning. Please, if you had individual questions for the speakers, find them over lunch, ask your questions, but do give them time to eat as well. But let's just say thank you to our panelists.